Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the OVS VAP Training Center webinar, Financial Sustainability for Victim Assistance Programs. I'm Blake Cush, the Director of Training Outreach at OVS. Our Director, Elizabeth Cronin, is also with us today and will offer some opening remarks shortly after I cover a little webinar housekeeping. Today's webinar will be led by Jenny Amstutz of JA Strategies and Alan Krieger of Krieger Solutions. Jenny and Alan have more than 40 years of combined experience in consulting and training, working with nonprofits and agencies around the state of New York, and both also have served as executive directors of nonprofit organizations and have master's degrees in management. So we understand your programs under unique forms of stress during this time, and today's webinar is the fourth in our new resilience webinar series, which was developed with the goal of helping you tackle some of these pressing issues. So a full list of those trainings in the series are on your screen. You can also learn more about them on our website at ovs.ny.gov/training. Those links and some other ones will be shared in the chat box, so open that up when you have a chance and you can see and have direct access to those. Each webinar is also, including today's, is also being recorded, and links are made available on that same training page and can be also accessed via our OVS Training YouTube channel. We really encourage you, if you couldn't make it or if you want some of your other colleagues to attend or see some of the content that's covered, take a look at those links and feel free to share. We'd like to remind you too, at this time, we're also offering free increased access to both Jenny and Alan from the OVS Training Technical Assistance Request Program, or TARP, through individual and small group coaching sessions. Again, you can learn more about and access all of these free resources on the same training webpage. Those information is also available in the slides that we've made available to you. So as soon as you exit today's webinar, you'll be directed to an evaluation survey on the presentation. Please take a couple minutes, give us some feedback. I think there's only 11 or 12 questions in there. And all of that feedback gives us an opportunity to immediately improve our next offering, our next training that we host. And we really appreciate any time you spend on that. So you also have an opportunity at the very end of that evaluation to let us know if you'd like some more follow-up or information on how to receive additional training. With that said, I'd like to go ahead and officially welcome the Office of Victim Services Director, Elizabeth Cronin. I'm going to unmute you.
Victim assistance providers on the call. Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. On this webinar today, which is wonderful, we're so happy to be able to offer these kind of trainings for you. Welcome to my office, which is also known as my kitchen. A lot of us are learning how to do things in a really different way. We just got through Crime Victims' Rights Week, and although it was unusual to say the least, for me, it's probably been the most inspiring Crime Victims' Rights Week because you are still operating and offering services. And if anything speaks to why we honor crime victim service professionals, that is exactly why. Because despite everything, you still get the job done and you still make your services available to people, and that is priceless. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts about, excuse me 1 second, another phone is ringing. Thank you. Okay, this is working from home 101. So the reason that we're offering this program is not specifically because of what we're going through with the pandemic, although I think it's become really clear to most of us that we are going to be living in a very different world, at least for a while. And so, you know, sustainability is an issue that we know, we've heard from programs. We certainly have to think about it too. It's something that everyone who offers a service has to be thinking about, and especially for a lot of you who are not-for-profits, you're always looking at, you know, where do we get the funding from? What sources can support us, and how do we do that and plan for the long term so that we know that we can continue offering these services? It's a very delicate balance. I have sat on many boards, and I understand the challenges that you face. And, you know, government funding can be difficult We know the rules are really difficult, but even knowing from year to year what's going to be available can be really challenging. And so what we're trying to do is provide training that will answer some of these questions, give you some food for thought about what the future is going to look like, and how to work within the context of what's going on to figure out how you're going to sustain your program, because that is the bottom line. There are always going to be victims of crime, unfortunately. Our jobs will never become obsolete, and so we have to continually make services available so that when and if people need them, that there's a place that they can go. So, this is something that I'm sure you're always thinking about, and now more than ever, it's appropriate. So, as we move into this new time, this new paradigm, we, have to be considering, like, how do we do things maybe in a different way? We were able at OVS to work remotely pretty easily. We've been, not without some glitches, but we have been talking about planning for how we operate under emergencies. This was not an emergency that we necessarily predicted that we would be facing, where, in mass casualty situations, we have two offices, so we often think that, well, we can operate out of one or the other. But we did get a lot of people equipment and trained to use it so that in the inevitability, of an event, they would be able to work remotely. And so we were able to get up and running pretty quickly. And that's going to be a new normal for a while. So those are the kinds of things that we need to talk about. And it's what we also need to hear from you. I have asked our advisory council to provide us some feedback about, what this is going to look like going forward, as some victims have not been able to come forward because of the fear of getting sick or going into shelter or whatever the reasons they can't get out of the house. They're going to be coming to you when this begins to subside, and so we have to think about how are we going to be able to offer services under those conditions. So anyway, we need to look toward the future, even the short-term future, and that's why we're looking to provide this service. So if we could go to the next slide, what the numbers are. So, we warned programs, we were worried about the continued robustness of VOCA funding going forward. And so when we sent the letters out in June notifying programs about their VOCA awards, I think we were fairly transparent about our concern regarding the availability of the level of VOCA funding that we had been getting. In 2014, which was the first year that I was at OVS when we were doing an RFA, we had $26 million. And then in 2015, it went to 118, and it's been fluctuating all over the place without any real predictability. And so, then the numbers started to come down. And as I indicated in the advisory bulletin that we sent out on April 22nd, our 2020 award was 26% less than the amount we got in 19, and 19 was 28% less than we got in 18. So you can see it's a downward trajectory, which is of concern to us and our support of you. So, what our mission is to do whatever advocacy we need to do on behalf of the programs, but also to be transparent and upfront with you about what we're seeing and, what you guys can do to work on this as well. And that's not the direct point of this webinar, so I won't belabor the point. We will be talking with you more about those specifics, but we really need it to be kind of in your mind about going forward in the future. Now, that being said, we have committed to supporting you with the RFA and on the different grants that we've had, the attorney grant, the case manager. We will continue to support those, and we will continue to honor the commitments that we made to you on those grants. It's after those grants run out where things become a little murkier. Now, we don't know what's going to happen with the Crime Victim Fund. The problem is that there is very limited money going into the Crime Victim Fund. So the reason that we were seeing those enormous awards was because the federal government was settling criminal cases with large corporations like Volkswagen. So these enormous settlements were going into the Crime Victim Fund. That is not happening now. And so there are a variety of ways that our office is looking at this, that there's a lot of associations, like I mentioned, in the National Association of VOCA Administrators is advocating for the federal government to be looking at different sources of revenue to go into the Crime Victim Fund. So we don't know what the, let's move this. So I see questions coming up, but we're going to, I don't want to keep going on this because I think we need to have the trainers provide you with the information about sustainability. But we
Elizabeth,
want
for context, a couple of the questions are just about why is the fund being depleted.
Oh, okay.
That's really,
so,
really the
I mean,
gist.
one of the things that we're going to be talking about with you over the next few months is what goes into the fund. I think I mentioned it in the bulletin that went out, that for the most part, it's fines, fees. It's sort of like the state fund. It's fines, fees, that sort of thing. And when the Justice Department was going after large corporate malfeasors, then a significant amount of money was going into the Crime Victim Fund, which made it flush. And then, for obvious reasons, it made the states more flush. We've been really grateful that we have been able to do as much as we have when we got that additional funding, and really tried to make it available, tried to do some really innovative things, and your programs were coming up with some really amazing, innovative ideas for how to utilize this money. So it's been wonderful, but it's also been a challenge because it came out of the blue, and so it required a lot of different sorts of procedures. And as you know, the state is very difficult when it comes to procurements because there are a lot of steps that you have to go through. It takes a really long time. So there have been a lot of challenges, notwithstanding the robustness of the fund. So there are different avenues that are being explored about how we can build up the Crime Victim Fund, including things like having partial civil settlements from corporations go into the fund, or non-prosecution agreement settlements. So there are some things. I can't imagine that it would be a very politically expedient thing for people not to support crime victim programs and crime victims, especially for a Justice Department that is very focused on accountability by offenders. So it's something that we're going to continue to pursue, and we will also work with you on those things following this. So I thought there was one other question, Blake.
Yeah, just in relation to COVID-19 and concerns that will further decrease funds in 2021.
Well, I mean, the COVID, is such an unknown at this point, and it's something that we're paying a lot of attention to. The stimulus bills that have been coming out recently have included some funding for some crime victims programs like FIPSA, but they have not regarding VOCA. Now, there is some conversation with the Senate about including VOCA in as part of these stimulus programs. So these are all things that we are pursuing and will continue to pursue, and we'll let you know and enlist your voices, because those are the ones that really matter, I think, in the end. And we'll project a united front in how to do this going forward. And maybe some of this is sky is falling, and I really hope so, because I don't like what I see in the way that it's going. But there are a lot of associations and a lot of people out there who are focused on this, who are preparing to do advocacy around it, and we will keep talking with you about that. So for right now, I think we have to focus on getting through this crisis. I hope that you and everyone you know is well and healthy. I found out yesterday my neighbors across the street, the entire family is stricken with this. So it's really, it's pretty scary, but thank you for continuing to provide services notwithstanding what's going on here. And we'll talk further about, how we start to get back, what victim services will look like in the near future, and, how we can support you through negotiating what is going to be a very confusing and challenging time. So, Blake, thanks again for setting up this training series, and thanks to Jenny and Alan for your participation in the work that we're doing and providing all this wonderful training. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We're going to turn it over to Jenny and Al now, and we get started.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. That was a great overview, and thanks, Blake, for being our coordinator. Good morning, everybody. Before we get started, I wanted to just go over the WebEx controls, if anybody hasn't been on a webinar with us yet. If you move your cursor over to the screen, a menu should pop up like the one you see on your screen on the slide. And in the middle is a little bubble with it's a blue logo with an icon with a bubble in it, and that's the chat box. It could either be blue or gray. If it's gray, your chat box isn't open yet, so click on it. If it's blue, your chat box is open. And if you look over to the right on the slide, you see a little thing that says to all panelists. And so we request that you set your chat to that so that you can ask questions and it'll go to all of us, because we're not all monitoring it at the same time. And this way it doesn't interrupt other people, distract them. At some point, we're going to ask you to share with all participants. So there's another click on the drop-down menu that says all participants, and we'd like you to click to that when we direct you to. But the rest of the time, if you keep it on all panelists, so if you keep it open now and with all panelists, you'll be ready to ask your questions. We have 297 participants as of now, so that's why we can't have open mics. And we do welcome your questions and look forward to answering them as we go along. I'm going to shut off my video and get on with the program here. Okay, so let's start by reviewing our objectives for the session today. The webinar is designed to give you the tools you need to understand the components of financial stability so you can assess your program's financial risk and begin to develop strategies to reduce that risk and maximize financial sustainability. Then we'll briefly explore what goes into the development of a long-term sustainability plan. We'll touch on strategies, including reviewing options for cost savings and how to assess your board and staff's readiness for resource development. These are all very large topics, and this webinar is designed to give you a high-level overview of financial sustainability. We may present additional webinars in the future to follow up on some of these if there's interest. We can also assist with individual coaching if you'd like to discuss this further. This webinar is designed to run 45 minutes because it's a big topic, a little longer than some of the other ones we've delivered. The University of Kansas Community Toolbox defines sustainability as an active process that includes establishing your initiative or your program and at the same time developing relationships, practices, and procedures for your program to closely connect it with your community. And that's one of the keys to sustainability. Your program becomes a part of and valued by your community. Sustainability has two parts: financial sustainability and programmatic sustainability. Financial sustainability is being sure that you can generate enough resources today to meet your program's current needs and still plan effectively for the future. Program sustainability is the ability to develop your program and then expand and change it over time so it continues to be responsive to your clients and the changing environment. In our session today, we're going to focus on financial sustainability. So what are the components of this? To be financially sustainable, your programs have to have rigor, which means they need to be successful and effectively meet community needs. It's also important to be aware of how your staffing is dependent on various funding streams, and then use this information to analyze the risk to various staff funded by multiple grants. Another key component is having fiscal ownership by your board and having an effective financial system. Many funders restrict what you can use your funding for, so it's important to also have some flexible or unrestricted revenue to cover things that funders won't pay for. And as we said earlier, it's critical that your program is seen as vital to your community and has its full support. We're going to have a poll in just a few minutes with 3 questions on it. Give us a better feel for who's on the webinar with us. The first question asks whether your board of directors and leadership regularly review your degree of dependency on different funding streams and analyze your risk to keep a close eye on financial sustainability. If you don't have contact with your board or your public agency without a board, you can just answer this based on your agency's leadership. The second question asks whether your board takes ownership of their role in financial sustainability of your organization. In other words, is your board actively engaged and focused on this? If you don't have a board of directors, you can answer not applicable. And the third question asks if your organization has sources of flexible or unrestricted revenue to help you fill gaps and underwrite unfunded tasks and expenses. Please answer each question as yes, somewhat, or no. And if you don't know, you can select don't know. We're going to open the poll now, and you should see it pop up on your screen on the right-hand side. You have just over a minute to complete the poll, and you may have to scroll down to get to the third question. When you're ready, please submit. Click Submit in the lower right-hand corner. And you got about a minute left. If you can't see the third question, there's a scroll bar all the way to the right.
While these polls are finishing up, I just wanted to remind everybody in the chat box, we're going to post, because a few of you have already asked questions about access to the slides, we're going to post a link to today's PowerPoint presentation as well.
You got about 15 seconds. If you haven't finished, make your best guess and hit submit. Okay, so the poll is closed, and now we're going to post the responses and see what we have. Blake, if you can publish the responses. There we go. Okay, so on the first question, how well does your board review dependency and really analyze your risk? If you can't see the percents, I can't. You have to grab the screen and drag it a little bit over. There you go. So about a third said yes, and about a third didn't answer. So probably it's a not knowing. So that's good. Of those that answered, quite a few, very high percent, so they do that. So that's great to see. Does the board own their role in financial sustainability? We had about a third between yes and somewhat, and very few no's on these, which is great, but quite a few don't knows or not answering. And then, do you have sources of flexible funding? And this one shifts a little more somewhat than yes, but again, about 40% there, and no's a little bigger, but still on the small side there. Okay, all right, great. So it sounds like those that answered, at least a third of you have a fairly active board and actively engaged in financial sustainability, which is great. And board ownership, which we'll talk about more later, is really a critical piece to making this successful. Okay, to close the poll, if you go to the upper right-hand corner there's a little X, and that can close it and get it off your screen if you'd like. And our first topic we're going to talk about today is programmatic rigor, how to make sure that your program is strong, effective, and meets community needs. These are the foundational keys to fiscal sustainability. While not every program or service you provide will generate net income, it's important that staff and board leaders have a clear understanding of which programs are mission critical and under what circumstances even beloved programs may be subject to change or elimination. It's preferable to have this discussion at least on an annual basis and not wait until a funding crisis appears. While all your programs have value, being able to clarify the financial needs and resources for each program and service area is essential to ensuring the fiscal health of the organization as a whole. To maintain a strong programmatic rigor, you need to regularly evaluate the effectiveness of your services on a program-by-program basis. You want to be sure that each program is producing meaningful and measurable results. In ensuring programmatic rigor, you also want to think about how each program relates to your mission. Identify which are the core programs and which are a little more peripheral. In thinking about financial sustainability, we want to focus most on the programs that are closest to our mission. In addition to our internal review and assessment, we want to consider how the community sees our programs. They're most likely to support programs that they most value. If our assessment and the community's assessment differs greatly, we may have difficulty protecting what we consider to be the core programs. Jenny's going to talk about dependency awareness and risk analysis.
Thanks, Alan. Excuse me, can you hear me? Hopefully. Before we get into a discussion about how to make our programs financially sustainable, especially in a declining revenue situation, it's important to do a risk analysis. This risk analysis will help us look at how dependent a program or organization is on any one revenue source, and what the risk to the overall functioning of the program would be if that revenue source was to decrease or to go away. The model we're using here is a standard risk assessment, or risk analysis, or risk assessment model, and it's used in all kinds of industries. We've altered it slightly for service programs. Over the next few slides, we'll review these 5 different steps of the risk analysis. The first step is to identify the possible hazards or risks. In some industry risk assessments, the hazards might be natural disasters or workplace hazards. In others, it might be competition risk. We're going to be looking at financial risk from our funding sources. The second step is to assess the consequences from the identified hazard on the program or on the organization. Who or what might be harmed, and what will that look like? Next, and the third, in the middle part of the risk assessment, we're going to evaluate the likelihood of each of the risks identified and decide on actions that can be taken now to minimize the impact of the risk. Once that's done, we can create an action plan for implementing those precautionary actions and put them into effect. The final step is to evaluate, review the risk assessment plan, and update it periodically. So in the first step of the analysis, we identify risks or hazards in our programs. And because we're doing our analysis related to financial sustainability, the risks specifically in how our programs are funded. In order to do that, we need to look at what the most important programs and services are in our agencies. These are the programs that have the greatest impact on your mission and on the people that we serve. When Alan spoke about programmatic rigor a minute ago, these are your programs that are the most rigorous. Now think about funding for each of these programs. Are they funded by one or two funding streams, or is the revenue that supports them more diverse? Do you have unrestricted revenue that will help mitigate any hazards? Unrestricted revenue is usually revenue, such as individual donations or program fees, that you can put towards any expense or program in your agency. The funder doesn't designate or restrict how it's spent. If you have important programs that are funded entirely by a single grant, those might be your programs that would be at greatest risk. Your lowest risk programs are the ones that are either largely funded by fees or those that have diverse funding streams or are largely funded by unrestricted dollars. So which of those programs are the ones that are at greatest risk and at lowest risk? Once you've thought through the hazards and risks of your programs, you should do the same thing thinking about your staff. How are your staff funded? Which staff roles are at the greatest risk? Do you have important staff members, for instance, members of your leadership staff, who are largely funded by one or two grants? What happens if those grants are defunded or are reduced slightly? Now you've identified the hazards or risks to staff and programs. Next, we take the analysis a step further. What would be the consequences to you if the risks materialize? If you lost some or all of any one important revenue stream or grant? Knowing how your staff is funded, how would you need to adjust your staffing patterns? Would you simply eliminate staff who are funded under that grant, or would you need to consider other options? Would you have to find ways to fully fund the salary of a program director or an executive director if they lost that funding from one of their grants? Finally, or next, we would look at what the impact on the programs that are most important to your mission, your most programmatically rigorous programs. If those programs lost funding, would you be left with programs that are less impactful or less important to what you do as an organization? Finally, you want to think about whether or not you have a plan in place for how you are going to replace funding over time. So Elizabeth talked a little bit in this one case about OVS funding, which may be reduced over time. So is there a way do you have a plan to think about how you might replace that over time? So this is just assessing kind of consequences, just thinking about that. In this middle step, we're going to evaluate the risk and decide on our precautionary actions. This is a part of a risk analysis. You really begin to set in place a plan for mitigating your risks for your most important programs. Some keys to this step is thinking about how you'll maintain your programs and your staff members that are integral to implementing the mission of your program or organization. During this step, you're going to have to think about the hard decisions you might need to make. As a leader or a leadership team, it's time to analyze what your options are for mitigating risk. You might need to explore cutting some costs. You might also think about reorganizing how services are offered. And you might want to set a plan for increasing other revenue. Later in the webinar, we're going to talk about all three of these options. Once you've looked at all of your possible options for mitigating the risk, you'll need to decide on one or two that you're going to pursue. The fourth step is your detail step. You've just decided on some precautionary actions, but here you create the details for putting those actions into motion. You'll do that with your detailed sustainability plan. A sustainability plan is a roadmap for achieving long-term goals. Like a strategic plan, it includes not just the action you plan to take, but also the individual steps you'll need to achieve your goals and make your programs more financially sustainable. The plan may include actions such as changing your program or staffing model. If you lose funding in any one area, this is where you'll indicate exactly how you're going to adjust your staffing. What staff positions are vital that you'll find new funding for when the old funding disappears, and what staff positions you might need to eliminate. You can implement steps to secure new resources. If you're part of a program that has always been almost entirely funded by one or two grants or funding streams, it might be time to start diversifying your funding base. I'm going to spend more time later in the webinar talking about things you want to think about before you get started on a fundraising plan. And as Alan mentioned, we hope if there's enough interest, we may be able to do additional webinars on this later in the year. Finally, your plan might include strategies to develop partnerships and collaborations to create cost savings. Alan will talk a little bit more about those in a while. Oh. Hold on, sorry, everybody, my clicker went bad. Like with any good plan, your risk analysis, in a risk analysis situation, you need to make sure your final step is to evaluate your risk analysis and your sustainability plan. And because this is a plan based on perceived risk, you're going to need to review it on a regular basis because risks and reality can change quickly. Although that practically goes without saying. We've changed everything that we've needed to do and all of our analysis very quickly in the past 2 months. So these things continually need to be looked at and updated. Make it a habit to review your analysis 2 or 3 times per year. This is something you should do with your leadership team and with your board if you have one. Look at the programs that you thought were priorities for your organization. Is that still the case? Are the precautions and strategies that you included in the plan still feasible? Has anything changed with current people in certain staff roles or with certain programs that would require you to alter your strategies? Once you've answered these questions, make sure to adjust and update your plan as needed. The risk analysis and the sustainability plan should be presented to the board annually as part of your strategic planning discussions. These 2 things really should go hand in hand. Now I am going to turn it back over to Alan, who's going to talk about fiscal ownership and some other topics.
Thanks, Jenny. So dependency awareness and risk analysis and planning kind of sets the foundation for everything. And now we're going to talk about a number of factors that will make you more fiscally sustainable, a stronger organization. So the first is fiscal ownership by the board. And active engagement by the board in your agency's finances is key because it helps maintain strong board support for your operation overall. Financial ownership involves a few elements. The first is that both the board and staff recognize that the board has a clear and specific role in the financial sustainability of the organization. This includes that the board regularly reviews and understands your revenues and expenses and has a clear understanding of the agency's financial position currently and looking into the future. While there may be a finance committee that delves into this in some depth, all board members should have a general understanding of the organization's finances. In addition, all board members need to own their fiduciary responsibility, which is more than just financial responsibility. Being a fiduciary means being bound ethically to act in the agency's best interests. A fiduciary is responsible for the agency's overall well-being, which, while it includes financial health, goes far beyond that. It also includes placing the agency's well-being before their own personal interests and paying close attention to how the agency manages its programs and finances and how it relates to the community. In order for the board and management to have a clear picture of the agency's finances, it's critical that there be timely and effective financial reporting, and that this data guides careful financial management. Good financial reporting and management involves a number of critical components. If you're not closely involved in this aspect of the agency, it may be a good idea for you to find out how your agency is addressing this and what you can do to help promote overall sound financial management. The first element is to have accurate and up-to-date financial system that accurately records all income and expenses and includes an approved agency budget. The system then needs to produce useful monthly reports that show the revenue expenses for each program and compares that to each program's budget and the overall agency budget. It's essential that the board as well as management is actively involved in reviewing these reports on a regular basis. The board generally reviews this at a fairly high level, while program management looks more closely at their individual program reports. It's important that all program leadership have a clear understanding of their financial system and how to read a report. If they're done well, they're not hard to read, and it does take a little practice, but it's an important piece of control and financial stability. In addition, management and board need to work together collaboratively to produce budgets for the coming year. For agencies over a certain size, there also needs to be a financial audit or review by an outside auditor. The audit report needs to be carefully reviewed by senior management and the board of directors. To ensure safe and accurate management of funds, the agency needs clear financial policies and procedures that produce careful separation of duties. This provides good security control and prevents fraud. This is something the auditors should review on an annual basis as well. And finally, since unexpected circumstances can come up, including the current pandemic, extreme weather events, and serious financial downturns, It's important that the agency have funds to carry it for at least 3 to 6 months of operation. It's best to have this money available in a savings account or other easily accessed investment options. Where that's not possible, it's important to establish a line of credit with a local bank. This line of credit should be established before it's needed, not in the middle of a financial crisis. In our current environment, we face many potential financial challenges. There are 2 basic strategies for addressing this: cutting costs while maintaining services and/or increasing fundraising or other means of building revenue to support your programs. With cost cutting, you can reduce expenses by eliminating some expenses and perhaps reducing services, or think about collaborating to maintain services at a reduced level of cost. Let's begin looking at sustainability strategies by exploring cutting costs while maintaining services. The first and most direct approach is to try eliminating expenses. This should begin with looking back over the past 3 years of your financial statements, individually by program and for the agency overall. Look to see if any costs have increased dramatically. That would be a first target to investigate. Also, as you review reports for each program and administrative area, are there expenses that are no longer essential to successful operation? You may have moved in a slightly different direction and can now eliminate positions that are no longer key to the program. You may have some expenses that are nice but no longer essential, such as hard copy newsletters in this day of email. Additional phone lines can also be eliminated if you're doing more with texting and email. And office space could possibly be reduced, especially if you found some benefit to people working remotely through this crisis. If that's not enough, the next step would be to look for expenses that, if cut, would only have a small impact on program and operations. This step is more difficult because we don't want to diminish our programs in any way. However, should we encounter financial challenges, it's important to explore this area in advance. It's most helpful to do this exploration not when you're in the middle of a crisis. And finally, technology has provided many avenues for increased efficiency and may point out ways for eliminating expenses that we no longer need, such as a separate dedicated fax line if you're now scanning and emailing things, large printers when we now distribute more documents electronically, improved financial accounting software to save on bookkeeping costs, and so on. This conversation needs to include a wide range of program and administrative staff, and the results of these discussions should be brought to the board for their review and input. It's ultimately the board that's responsible for setting the agency's budget and ensuring that the agency is financially sound. However, these board discussions should be informed by careful staff analysis and recommendations. Another way to reduce expenses is through collaboration. If you have excess space or excess staff capacity, which I understand is a rare event, you may want to find other agencies in your community that might need the extra space or might be able to utilize your staff in some related capacity. Once you've identified some excess resources, take time to think about who could use this best. It could be another agency that provides similar services, an agency providing different services, or even a small business that's growing and could use some space and perhaps support for back office operations. On the other hand, if you need more capacity, think about whether there are agencies or small businesses who have retrenched and perhaps have office space and even administrative capacity that they could share with you at a cheaper cost than you creating it for yourself. There may be skilled program staff and other agencies who are underutilized due to lack of funding and can provide great services for you and your clients. It's also important to think about agencies you might have viewed as a competitor. Are they providing similar services? Is there overlap? Is there a way you can work together collaboratively to maintain the level of services to your community at a decreased cost? And on the administrative side, are there ways to share some of the administrative overhead that could result in savings for both agencies? It may also be cheaper to contract out certain services rather than maintain them yourselves. If your building is small, it may not be cost effective to have your own maintenance staff, and instead hire a contractor to provide needed services, including cleaning. The same with technical support and certain administrative functions. It may be more cost effective to contract them out than to provide them yourselves. Contracting out also can allow you to purchase more skilled services than you might be able to afford if you were doing it directly. When you contract services out and make other large purchases, it's always a good idea to consider competitive bidding as a way to reduce expenses. So 2 useful paths to reduce expenses are to try to cut unnecessary costs and to share services and resources as much as possible. In a few minutes, Jenny's going to present our final section, which is building more diverse and flexible sources of revenue. But before we go there, we'd like to get some input from you about what your agency has been doing to cut costs or share services. What have you heard from other organizations along these lines? And what else might you have done to help improve your financial stability? What we'd like you to do is change your chat box to all participants so that everybody can see your answers as they scroll by. And we'd like to just take a couple minutes to give everybody a chance to share strategies, ideas that either you've done or you've heard about or you're considering. And again, change your chat to all participants, and people can read along as people type. Okay, I'm not seeing any ideas, so maybe you're on this webinar because you want our ideas. We've given you some. Hopefully none of you are yet in a financial challenged position, but we all heard from Elizabeth, and we just know from the economy that this is coming. So we hope all participants isn't an option. Oh, okay, well then we'll try to read it out real quick.
Yeah, it looks like all participants is an option, but if you guys share it with the panelists, we can read out loud some of them.
Okay, so we have collaborate with other program agencies regarding services, doing more fundraising, contract out IT support, cleaning service, and HR support. HR is a big one. There's so much expertise involved there. Unless you're a large agency, you really can't afford somebody who knows all that, and trying to do it. Winging it doesn't always work too well, so that's a great suggestion. Partnering with other community agencies, so people have been trying that. Having more admin staff work from home to open up office space needed for program staff. Again, we're getting used to that and finding that there's quite a lot of effectiveness in working from home. Getting more volunteers in to help with admin and program services. Sharing space in many locations if you're serving a wide geographic area. Being able to find agencies that are located there and not having your own. We have an agency renting office space in our building, so again, sharing excess capacity. Been collaborating with other victim assistance programs for travel to reduce mileage costs. That's great. Will you provide a list of agencies on the call so we can have further conversations from other entities? Blake, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, including some of the chat recommendations or thoughts. We'll export all of this and be able to share with all of you who attended today.
Okay. Decreasing operating expenses to keep essential staff. Again, that's prioritizing, that's analyzing your risk and deciding what's the core that you want to keep. Continue to look at funding options to collaborate with partner agencies. And a lot of funders are now looking for collaboration. That's an important criteria in getting the grant, so they're kind of pushing you into that. Combining private funding with government funding to expand support existing programs. Have more meetings, trainings remotely online. Okay. And we've certainly been doing that, shifting to more of an online training approach, which has a number of benefits for easy access. So great. Those are some great comments. And if others come in, we'll try to record these and share them with everybody. But now I want to turn it over to Jenny to pick up on our next topic.
Thanks, Alan. And those were some great ideas. And I think, as Blake said, we'll share them out. Some of the ideas about co-locating and, I think Alan may have mentioned it, but somebody mentioned contracting with a much bigger agency to use their IT and their back office support is a good way to cut costs while getting the services that you need. So once you have explored all the ways to maximize your funds and think about the money that you do have available, the final way to improve your financial sustainability is to make sure that you have diverse and flexible sources of revenue. When we talk about diverse sources of revenue, we're talking not only about having grants from a diverse number of sources, but also having more than just grants. You want to have sources of revenue like those raised from individuals in your community that are flexible enough to allow you to move them where you need them most. Fundraising is difficult to get into. It's time consuming, and in times like these, it can really feel really uncertain. So why might you want to consider either starting or growing your fundraising program? Obviously, it reduces dependency on a single source. Elizabeth started the webinar by saying that VOCA funding is not necessarily as secure it might once have been, and we can say that about a lot of grant sources. So if you're entirely dependent on OVS or another type of funding, you want to consider reducing that dependency. Fundraising can provide a regular source of unrestricted income, and as I mentioned before, revenue that's unrestricted by the donor can be used where you need it most, for administrative salaries or for food or for a new roof, and not where your funder tells you to use it. If you can find new revenue sources and increase unrestricted resources, it will allow your programs to maintain their level of service even if your grant sources reduce their support. As Alan said, funders like to see collaboration, but they also like to see a diversified base. It gives them the confidence that the program will continue long term. Raising funds increases your organization's ability to respond to needs and opportunities for new programs when they do emerge. And finally, and really it's the combination of all the bullets above, it creates programs that are sustainable long term. We scheduled and wrote most of this webinar before it was evident how the current coronavirus crisis was going to impact both our programs and our economy as a whole. On initial reflection, we thought maybe now was not a good time to start talking about fundraising. But we decided it seems that now it's especially important that we think about financial sustainability. And while this crisis is very different than those we've seen in the past, there are some lessons that, that we have learned in the past that we can keep in mind as we start to think about looking towards diversifying our funding base and thinking about our fundraising program. The first lesson is that we don't want to wait for the crisis to end to begin or to continue to think about fundraising. If you're new to this, it's never too early to start to put a fundraising plan in place. If you already have supporters or donors, now is a really good time to communicate with them. Let them know how you're continuing your important work and how you're impacting the community, even though everyone is working from home. Let them know that you're still out there. Many organizations have delayed some of their fundraising letters or solicitations in the short term, but you want to be ready to start up again as soon as things stabilize. It's important for us to remember that philanthropy is resilient. We've seen a lot of generation just in these last few weeks to help support those who are hurting now when our businesses are closed. And during the last economic crisis in 2008 and 2009, charitable giving only dropped a little, 4%, even when the market dropped by much more. Finally, we have to remember that foundations are required to give a certain amount of money every year, and it's not actually based on their financial performance in the current year, but in the previous year's performance. So last year was a banner year for growth for many foundations, and so they will still be giving at higher levels this year. They may be changing their priorities somewhat, so make sure that they're serving the people who are most in need, so you might want to keep that in mind. Every year, an organization called Giving USA does an annual report on philanthropy with lots of details about giving levels to nonprofits across the country. I like to use this chart to point out that while organizations and boards often look first to foundations and corporations to grow their fundraising program, those two sources of philanthropy make up less than a quarter of all giving. So, in 2008, the last year for which the data is available, you can see that those two, I think foundations is 18%, and corporations is just 5%, so less than 25%. Individuals, on the other hand, account for nearly 70% of all giving. That's people giving to people. So as you begin to think about a fundraising program, think about focusing your energy on raising money from individuals. It takes more work in the short term, but the amount of funding available is much larger and it's much more sustainable over a longer period of time. And this is just a chart to give you a breakdown of where people give. Of the $427 billion of giving that happened in 2018, 12% of it went to human services. That amounted to over $51 billion. Health organizations received almost $41 billion. Of course, those are large numbers that serve the entire country. Our goal is to see if we can start to carve out our own small pieces of this giving for our agencies. In the initial phases of creating a fund development program and plan, you want to have a few things in place. And that's what I want to talk about today. And first and foremost, you can't get started with fund development without having a team of people to work on it. If you don't really have a fundraising program in place right now, then you probably won't have staff who can dedicate large portions of their days to fundraising. But you can't do fund development without putting in some staff and people hours. So who do you have available in your organization or affiliated with your organization who can be part of your fundraising team? If you have a nonprofit board, then they should be the first place you should go to for your fundraising team. The board has an important role in fiscal oversight and fund development, and I'll talk a little bit about that next. Beyond the board, the executive director is often an important part of the team because he or she is the face of the organization. Does your organization, your executive director right now, or your program director have time to dedicate and the flexibility with how they're funded to dedicate significant or some active time to be on the fundraising team? Next, you might have other staff who can be part of the team. We're going to talk at the end about how to maximize your staff resources and why. But beyond your board and staff, who else can you involve? Do you have volunteers? How many volunteers do you have? You might even consider creating a new cadre of volunteers who exclusively work on fundraising. Many organizations have created these types of teams. Think of Friends of the Symphony or Friends of the Library. These friends groups, these kind of external volunteer groups, are a great way to increase your fundraising human resources, the number of people you have working on fundraising for you. And if you're not a nonprofit organization, for instance, if you're working from within a government agency or in the DA's office, these friends groups can incorporate as a nonprofit and in order to help you fundraise from people who can't give to a government agency. I want to just spend a few minutes talking about your nonprofit board again, because they are really important when considering your fundraising program. If you have a board, your board should be actively involved in supporting your work, and before you initiate a fund development program, you should consider their readiness. First, have they embraced their fund development role? By this, I mean, do they see it as an important part of their job description? If not, you need to think about doing some board development and maybe bringing in a consultant to talk about the board's role in fundraising. Do they have connections to foundations and corporations that make donations or to wealthy people in the community who might become donors? If not, then consider expanding your board to include people in your community who do have those connections. Do your board members support you themselves by giving donations to the organization and attending all your events? If not, then work with a board chair to increase individual board member support and activeness. If your own board members don't support you, then it's hard to ask others in the community to do so. Do your board members talk about you in the community, serving as your organization's ambassadors, so that more people know about you and the work that you do? If not, think about helping them by having them practice their elevator speeches during a board meeting or providing them with fact sheets or business cards that they can share with others. And finally, does your board have a fund development committee already, or have they ever created a fund development plan? If not, it's time to talk with the board chair or with your executive committee about creating a fund, at least a committee, and having that committee start working on the plan. Now we're going to do a second poll to just get a sense of where everybody is, and to see that this is all a bit overwhelming, but with so many on the call, you'll be able to see that we all have different boards who are at a different level of readiness. So there are just two questions in the poll. And the first is, how strongly has your board embraced their fund development role? And we've given you a lot of options, so very much, that means they're very active in fundraising, somewhat, which means they may be, so you have some members that do, some members that don't. Very little means they're really not doing much fundraising at all. If you don't know, if you don't work with your board, then you click don't know. If you don't have a board, then you can click not applicable for this. And then the second question is, what % of your board members have connections to local foundations, local corporations, and wealthy members of your community? So, if you think about your board as a whole, how many of them have those connections that will help you with your fundraising? We're going to open your poll now, and you'll have about a minute to complete it, just like we did the last time. Go with your best guess. All right, you have about 10 seconds left, so if you haven't voted yet and you would like to, now is the time to do it. All right, we are going to close the poll now and publish the results so we can see how we did, what the variations are out there. All right, so so as you can see, everybody is all over the place. So there are a number of organizations, about 15% of the, so probably 30% of those of us who answered said that the board was has somewhat embraced their role as fund development. A smaller number has done that very much, and the good news is that only a few of you said that your boards have done that very little. For a lot of you, I know it's not applicable because you don't have boards, so it may be a time to think about, how you can get other people involved in fundraising for your organization. And then in the second question, it looks like about 15% of the people who answered, or 15% of the people overall, 30% of us who answered said somewhere between 50 and 100% of the board members have connections in the community. And I think that you want to strive to a place where at least half of your board has some connections, something they're bringing to the table. Everybody board members should bring something to the table, but if you're going to engage in a fundraising program, you want to make sure you're building your board up so that you have those connections. So I appreciate it. Everybody's responding, and it does give us a sense that boards are all over the place. So even if your board hasn't really thought about it at all, and doesn't have those connections, there are a lot of others out there like you, and it's an opportunity to start thinking in that direction. The final thing I'm going to talk about today is staff resources. And this is important because fundraising takes dedicated time. And before you start a program, I want, organizations really need to think about what staff they have available. Because even with the support and involvement of your board, and even with an active volunteer base, you're not going to be able to initiate a successful fund development program without staff on site to support it. Someone inside the organization will need to manage the board and the volunteers and keep the details. So as you start thinking about diversifying your funding base and raising additional revenue, spend some time assessing your staff resources. Think about your current staff. Who on staff has the time to take on different fundraising roles? And because we know that a lot of people are under restrictions because of the way they're funded, think about who is even allowed to work on fundraising. When you're creating your fundraising objectives, be specific about who will be doing what. It's not enough to say, Alan's going to write more grants or Jenny's going to be attending more networking events. Be specific about how many grants or how many events will take place so that it's an actionable objective on somebody's schedule, just the way serving a number of clients are. Finally, the devil is really in the details in fundraising. Somebody is going to need to be responsible for sending out thank you notes, updating your mailing list, and making sure that you are making connections with your donors. So make sure as you begin your fund development journey that there's enough staff time dedicated to donor data management. If you don't have anybody on staff who has that responsibility right now, it may be time before you explore fundraising and a fund development program to think about finding the funds to hire somebody, even part-time, whose responsibility will be to take all this on. So that is the end of our presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Alan to kind of close things out.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. So we've run over a little bit. I want to thank everybody. We had quite a few people stay with us. Almost everybody's still here. We have time for questions and comments. We're going to stick around. We'd be happy to answer any questions if people can type them in. You can also email them if, Jenny, you want to show the next slide?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry.
So there's our email address. If you have to get off, you could send us questions. As you leave, please complete the evaluation that pops up. We'd really appreciate your feedback. And again, we're going to keep the webinar open for another 15 minutes or so. If people have questions, feel free to type them in. We have one question pending so far. And Blake will be making the PowerPoint and a recording of this webinar available to everybody. That was a question someone just sent. So you'll be getting the slides and the recording if you want it. And
yeah.
Okay, so first question.
While we have a mass exodus, real quick, Alan, I just want to thank you two for joining us and putting together today's webinar. Alan is right. We really appreciate the feedback you guys give us in those evaluations, so take advantage of that. And we will stick around for a little bit for those of you want to hang tight and answer a few questions. Alan, if you want, I'll take that one that was in the queue earlier.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
We had a question about an organization considering billing for counseling. Essentially, they're asking, we were thinking about generating revenue and what kind of issues may that cause for OVS. And my response to that is just reach out directly to your contract management specialist at OVS. They can help guide you through a lot of those sort of peculiarities that come with making sure that you're staying, on top of things. There's lots of guidance both from OVC and from OVS. So stay in touch and communicate with them.
Okay, another question was, how do you diversify revenue sources without unintentionally ballooning program deliverables to the new sources? I'm not sure.
So one way to think about one of the advantages, I think, of really exploring individual giving instead of grants is, I think that is one of the real struggles of a grant program is funders and foundations love to fund new programs. And so they are looking for something that you're doing new and that you're adding program deliverables. But when you're doing a fundraising letter and you're raising money from individuals, then they're supporting the programs as a whole. Support the work that we do serving victims. And so you're not saying in a fundraising letter to an individual that it's going to serve each dollar. People do use that language, but it's not going for specifically increasing the number of people served. It's less answerable. Really it just needs to be served to be used for the programs that you already have. So that's one of the advantages of going after individual sources. If you are going after foundation sources, then the way to not increase, not to balloon your program deliverables is to be creative with the language and the types, what you're writing your grant for. But that takes a little bit more
there are
creativity.
community foundations that are less driven by new programs and want to support existing programs that are successful. So again, if you can make the case that your program meets a critical community need and you're doing it very well, you've got evaluation data and other things, community support, and that you're having funding challenges, or you just want to enhance the quality of services, the availability of services to the existing clients you have. And there are ways of writing it that you want to make your program more robust without increasing the number of services. I think you can phrase it in ways that, a community foundation may be more willing to go with that. But the big foundations are looking for new, innovative, something different, and it does just continue to strain organizations. Okay, we'll keep it open if anybody else has any.
There was a question, Alan, you wanted, we're a government agency, how do we start a board just for our, for the program? And that, so I think some of the boards, and I'm not sure I know what the CAC stands for. Blake, do you know?
I think it's Child Advocacy Center.
Oh, Child Advocacy Center. I should know what that is. I'm sorry. So in that case, it would be less like a nonprofit board. You could maybe do an advisory board model, or a friends model. So the advisory board would have less of a governing role, an official governing role. A nonprofit board has fiduciary responsibilities to the organization, as Alan spoke about. An advisory board, you bring together more just as a for advice, and maybe to do some fundraising if you have a vehicle with which they can do that fundraising.
Some people call it an honorary board, which means that they're only on there to give donations and give their name, and there's no other work involved, but they're there as a critical fundraising source.
Somebody asked about repeating what caused the loss of funding to, or is causing the loss of funding to OVS, which is the VOCA funds. This was recorded, and Elizabeth is much more articulate in explaining this, as she's a member of the National Association of VOCA Administrators. She's a board member with them. But the short and sweet of it is that there's a loss of revenue to the Crime Victims Fund at the federal level. Once we publish this recording, you're welcome to go back and listen to her. We had about 15 minutes where we covered that whole topic. But yeah, there's a lot going on at the federal level that's impacting this.
Okay, so we're happy to stick around. If there are additional questions, feel free to continue. We still have close to 200 people on the webinar with us.
There was one more question. Does a Friends of committee need to be created legally as a separate entity in New York State, or can it be treated like a volunteer committee? And I think it would depend on your organization. If you are a government agency and you want your Friends of committee to raise money for you, then I think they would need to be incorporated separately. I'm not a lawyer, so but I'm not sure how donations otherwise would go to a public agency. If you already have if you're already a nonprofit and you just wanted to create a volunteer committee for fundraising, then I think you could call them the Friends of the Child Advocacy Center, and that would work. But checks would need to then be written to the organization and not to the Friends of. Does that sound accurate, Alan, to you?
Yeah, and just, I'm not seeing any questions anymore, so for some reason they're not feeding me, so just feel free to jump in each time a question pops up, and I'll chime in if I've...
Okay. Oh, yeah, because they went to host and presenter, so...
Yeah, so if you send it to all panelists, then I won't feel left out.
And he probably has some better answers than I do, too, so that will be helpful. All right.
Now,
But
Ginny,
that may be, I think that
recently OVC had a sustainability webinar as well, and you were on that. Is there anything that you would recommend or tips that our participants could take from that? I'm happy to share a link to that recorded webinar in our YouTube notes for this as well when that comes out, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share what they had to say as well.
they spent more time. So we really focused on this webinar on the financial sustainability piece. They did more of the full sustainability package. So when Alan spoke at the beginning of both the program sustainability and the financial sustainability, they spent a lot more time talking about that. And we could, so that may be, and so that would be one thing that they added that we didn't do in this webinar. They had some resources that we could send out or include as on the website. Alan, what other thoughts?
Yeah, they had, I think, 8 aspects of sustainability. We broke it down into 2, and theirs were kind of subsets of the ones we mentioned. But yeah, it was a bigger, broader picture, covered a lot of different topics, and yeah, I think if you review it, you'll get a different sense than what we provided, but a lot of overlap. Clearly the financial piece is the foundation. Without funds, you're going to have a hard time providing services, and without quality programs, you will have a hard time raising funds. So those 2, we think, are the critical part.
Blake, can you repeat the question? Is what webinar are you discussing now? So can you talk a little bit about what that webinar was, because it was not part of this series, because it was not
The Office
OVS.
of Victims of Crime, OVC, issued a webinar on sustainability. This was about 2 weeks ago, I think. So we'll publish the link to that recorded webinar. It's kind of in a Q&A fashion as well, and we'll make that available when we share today's webinar on our YouTube channel. So everyone who attended today will get an email in about a day, maybe 2 days, with the recording link and some other resources that we promised you as well.
And then one more question came up, and that is, I'm going to I'm going to ask it, and then Alan, see what you have to say about it, because I'm not sure what I can say. What are your thoughts on the 2020 election influencing funding streams?
Influence the funding stream?
Influencing funding streams.
Oh, funding streams in general?
Yes.
Well, I think the 2020 election is going to either keep us going in the direction we're going or make a massive shift. And you combine that with the pandemic, and I think nobody wants to make any predictions. I would say if a Democrat gets in, there'll be more support for social programs. And if President Trump stays in, there'll be more support for the economy and the business community, and maybe that will trickle down to the public and nonprofit sector, and maybe not. But I don't want to get into political views, but obviously two very, very different philosophies going into the election, and depending on how it comes out, and the economy. I mean, I think that's the bigger issue. Is right now, as Jenny said, in 2008, giving didn't drop that much, even though the stock market went way down. But there was a delay that for the next year, corporations, foundations that are giving have to give based on the previous year, which was a great year last year. But then a year from now, they're giving based on this year, which will be a very poor year. A lot of small local businesses may be out of business or closed. So if you get support from your local community, depending on how hard hit you were, that could be a factor. I think on the other hand, one thing I read that is very encouraging, and I've seen it, is that there's a sense of community now. We're all really dependent on each other. We can make each other sick. We can make each other well. And I think communities are pulling together and people are pulling together, and there's more sense of, supporting each other. And I think you hopefully can tap into that coming out of the pandemic when you're back more in business and the economy begins to come back up, is that, hey, we all survived, we made it through, and now we need to grow. We need to, there's a lot of backlog of service needs and demand, and courts were closed, and now everything's open, and we really need the community to come and help us serve victims in our community. So I think that nothing to do with the election, but I think that's a trend that we haven't seen in a while, a sense of real community, and I think that's happening at the local level, and so I think that's an important thing that people could tap into and try to engage your community at a deeper way than you may currently do that.
I think that's a great point, Alan. And I think, to repeat that this is a really good time to make sure that your community knows how important you are. Not just to ask them for money, but, the services that you're providing, that the impact of what you do on the community as a whole, because victims are everywhere. So that piece of, Alan talked about programmatic rigor, and the most rigorous programs are the ones that the community understands how important they are. And part of a fund development and diversifying your revenue stream is making sure that people know the impact that you have and why it's important to support you. So even if it's just, making sure your people know that you're still there, know the importance of, coming out of Crime Victims Week last week, the importance of the services that you provide to victims in the community. I think that will help as much with sustainability as anything.
We still have 150 people with us, so please feel free to keep sending us questions. As you leave, please be sure to do the evaluation. We'd like your feedback. We'll keep it open another couple minutes and see if we get any more questions. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up shortly.
Really encourage you guys to stay in touch with your contract management specialists at OVS as well. They're there to be your advocate and help support you. We know it's a challenging time, but the better relationship you can build with them, the more it'll help you in the long run in navigating some of the intricacies of what it means to be an OVS grant recipient.
There's a question, what guidance do you have for municipalities versus nonprofits? Municipalities can't fundraise. Again, the idea of establishing a Friends of nonprofit group, and in this case, they could form a 501c3, and their purpose is simply to support your program or other programs like yours in the community. Donations would go to the nonprofit, and they would have to be set up as I'm not a lawyer in this area, but something of a foundation, private foundation. They would receive money and then disperse the money, and not provide services directly. So that's one option. And the other is to partner with an existing nonprofit that maybe provides some services to victims as well, different services, complementary services, and talk with them about doing a joint fundraiser where you're supporting them, and in return, some of the funds that get raised could go to help you with some of your services. Again, there's legality and there's politics, both. As municipalities don't want to be seen as competing with the nonprofit community, and municipalities have the ability to raise taxes, and that's how they get their revenue. Of course, not a popular thing to increase taxes. So I would say conversation with the local community, the giving community, if foundations in your community, if you have a community foundation, United Way, those kinds of organizations, maybe begin conversations with them, and certainly talk to your own leadership and make sure before you go anywhere how they feel about you taking a more proactive stance in that direction.
And I think that that's good advice anyway, just to make sure you're building enough support within your own leadership and within your municipality for the programs, so that they don't want you to go away if there's funding, if the program needs to grow, or if your funding begins to shrink and you want to maintain services, making sure that you have connections with throughout your municipality, so that people see the value of what you do and are less willing to, maybe more likely to help you find the funds to keep the program going if one of your funding streams is reduced.
We had a question about concern over people losing their jobs, and do we see them being cut, employment being cut anytime soon? And I guess it's hard to answer that without knowing specifics of each organization's bigger financial picture. But I do want to point out that earlier in today's webinar, Elizabeth mentioned that our current contracts in the 2019 RFA, so for the 3-year contracts that all OVS VAPs are funded under, are 100% guaranteed through 2021. So from that perspective, we can reassure you that we can guarantee that. What we're doing is making you aware of what's coming down the pipeline due to a lack of revenue in federal funds that will be impacting us, or could be impacting us, starting in 2021.
Yeah, and in terms of stress management, which is a big issue right now, and everybody in this, you can focus on the fact that the economy is struggling, or you can focus on the fact that it went down quickly and everybody expects it to go up quickly. Nobody knows, but I'm much happier when I think about it going up quickly than not. So since I try to be optimistic, and yes, there's a lot of job loss right now, the expectation is that most of them will come back fairly quickly. And so hope for the best and think about the best and plan for the worst, which is what we're talking about here today. What can you do if it doesn't happen? But I don't think there's value in worrying about things going bad. There's value in analyzing and planning for what might happen if things go bad, but then hope for the best. And there is a good chance. I'm not an economist or a lawyer or anything, but I do think there's a good chance that the economy will spring back fairly quickly. And it was a good economy before this, and it should come back pretty quickly. So.
Well, it's almost 11:30, so we really appreciate everybody hanging in for this long. We still have over 100 people in the room. We promise next week's building and managing teams remotely will not be quite so long. It will be another short, it will be one of our shorter webinars, just so people can, continue to think about how they're working with their teams in a remote environment.
Yeah. We also have one on Thursday as well, and that's from our partners at the Institute of Disaster Mental Health on psychological first aid. So as you exit, fill out your evaluation and keep checking back on our training webpage for updates, including links to the recordings for each PowerPoint and registration links for the future ones. But we appreciate all of you guys joining us today. Can't thank you enough.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Everyone, have a good one.